Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Lane. Um, I am a student at UC studying environmental science. I'm a senior this year. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Breakout session with Mr. Rob Bilott and Professor Bob Hyland. To structure this breakout session, we'd like to ask you to indicate that you want to make a comment or ask a question by typing your name in the chat. I will introduce you in the order in which your name appears so we can make sure that everyone who wants to has the opportunity to speak. For now, we'd ask that you keep your microphone muted if you're not speaking, and if you'd prefer not to speak when it's your turn, you're welcome to type your question in the chat and we'll ask it for you. All right, and I'll go ahead and get the conversation going by asking you guys, as a student myself, I know that when we're doing work that we feel is relevant to the community surrounding us and actually impactful outside of the world of academia, that it's easier to stay engaged, and that seems to be better for all parties involved. So what do you think universities can do to ensure students are getting that type of experience? Mr. Bilott, I'll go ahead and let you answer first.
Well, I think something like this is exactly what they ought to be doing, having events to highlight areas where you can be engaged and you can work on projects that go beyond just the academic sphere, and to see what kind of real-world impact you can have. It's events like this, I think, that ought to be as encouraged and as promoted as we can. This is what we ought to be doing, and this is what we ought to be making sure that people understand, how important, as we mentioned in the prior session, all of these different disciplines are in order to get the basic story out to people in a way that we can understand and that everybody can understand what's happening and understand how they can participate and how what they're doing is so critically important to that overall picture. So I really applaud what UC is doing, and not that I'm biased, but all three of my sons are UC students right now, so I'm really happy to see this being done at UC.
All three of Bilott's sons are at UC right now.
That's right.
So Eric, I missed the question because I was trying to figure out the breakout session situation, but it looks like Anna, forgive me for mispronouncing your name, Anna Buchholz has a question.
Yeah, so I'm not going to turn my camera on because I was on my treadmill during the first half of this. But so I'm a PhD level research scientist, and I study aquatic systems and aquatic toxicology. And one of the things that I've noticed and I always struggle with is, from your point of view, from a legal point of view, from a non-science perspective, what can us research scientists do to make our work matter? Because right now, it's I publish in a journal, and then who reads it besides other scientists? And then it might not get applied. So how can scientists work better with I guess the legal and other side of things to enact change? Thank you.
It's a great question, and one of the things that I've really been trying to work on as well is to find ways in which people from these different disciplines can interact with each other to get their work out and understood by people outside of their sphere. And for example, with people that are working on a scientific paper, finding ways that you can present the results or discuss what you're doing with a local community group that might be impacted by it, or people that are working on those issues, maybe at the state, local, or even federal government level. Because unfortunately, a lot of what we tend to do, and a lot of what, at least that I've seen over the past 30 years, is people working in what I'd call silos. Scientists that work solely within the scientific world and only present their papers to other scientific colleagues, or lawyers, who only work in their legal sphere and only are working on their legal briefs and only deal with the scientists, if they have to. and regulators, who don't really want to hear about what's going on in the scientific world or the legal world. So finding ways to bring those groups together or to present your information in formats different from what you're dealing with. And that's one of the things I struggled with. In the legal field, I was doing everything I could to get this PFAS story out to the public, writing letters to regulators, using all of my legal language and putting things together in legal briefs to courts. Yet that story still wasn't getting out. People still weren't understanding what was happening. It took folks that were skilled in communications, for example, that were able to set up websites for non-governmental organizations, environmental groups that were able to figure out what pieces of that information they could more effectively communicate in the way they typically work. And then, to have people to watch what happened when somebody that's a screenwriter, somebody that's working on a movie script or a documentary, to see how they pick different pieces of that story and are able to amplify it in a totally different way that reaches people that weren't picking up on how it was said through legal briefs or through scientific journals. So all of those different disciplines are incredibly important, and being able to kind of step outside your comfort zone and say, hey, I'm a scientist, I'm working on this scientific paper, but maybe I'll go take it to a community group, or maybe I'll go present it to this other organization that you don't typically work with. I would encourage that, and doing cross-disciplinary things like what we're doing here today, from people from different disciplines, different ways of conveying information, all coming together and finding more effective ways to communicate for all of us.
Yeah, no, I would just say from my perspective as a professor of professional writing, so I teach a scientific writing class, and two of the assignments in the class, one is a press release and one is a science brief. And a vast majority of the students are science majors, and they're like, why are we doing a press release? And the reason is that, yes, we want to share our findings in our discourse community, but so much of the amazing research that's going on has a practical application. So I would like the, undergrads who are going to go into the physical sciences or behavioral sciences to not just be able to communicate with their peers in their discourse community, but with the broader community. And I would love to collaborate with you if there's opportunity. We could talk about the ways that our respective departments could work together.
Yeah, that's great.
If you don't mind, I'm actually going to jump in. My name's Alani Welker. I'm a third-year student of biology at UC, and I'm one of the co-founders of Cincinnati for Justice here in Cincinnati. And just from listening to you guys speak and the panel members, it seems like what your issue is translating this information to the general public. And I don't know if this is just my young mind, but immediately when I heard you guys speak, I thought of a social media campaign. A lot of people discredit that just because it is a lax form of communication, but it's very powerful. I've seen movements with the Red Pearl movement in Uganda, Kong in 2012. It's a simple way to reach a large amount of people, and I think if specifically because you have such a well-formatted way to express what you're trying to get out within Dark Waters, I think it's very, very to the point in a way that is digestible. I think personally, if you had some kind of social media campaign, some kind of hashtag, I know it sounds silly because it's not. It's very different than this professional world that you've been used to being in. But I think that it could be effective.
Well, that's a great point. And in fact, when the Dark Waters movie was rolling out, beginning late 2019, right before the pandemic hit, one of the things that the studio that put the movie together did, Participant Media, they are very active in finding ways to communicate the story. And if you go on their website and just sort of look at the background of what their corporate philosophy is, why they do films, part of it is, finding effective ways to communicate stories like this that are of important social impact. They launched a social media campaign along with the film. It was called Fight Forever Chemicals. I think it was the hashtag Fight Forever Chemicals. And those of us like me that are dinosaurs that had to have my college-age sons explain to me how to use things like Twitter and Facebook and all of those things, that is, an incredibly effective way to get information out. And in fact, the social media campaign that was launched, I think actually won what they call a Shorty Award, a social media outreach award, and has been nominated for several others. So yeah, I mean that's part of the package of finding. You can't be limited to just a particular way of communicating. You've got to explore all the different ways in which people communicate. And as you heard in the primary panel here, not everybody has access to internet or has a phone or reads a newspaper. Different age groups rely on different types of media. So you've got to be able to find ways to communicate through all those different disciplines. So yeah, it's an excellent point.
It looks like Bridget Walsh has a question.
Hi, I'm Bridget Walsh. I'm in Denver, Colorado, and my focus is on a community, a low-income minority community that is located in the most toxic zip code in the United States, 80216. And my question, one of the participants pointed out that it's good to listen to scientists. And in Colorado, at least, we're finding it's very difficult to find academics or scientists who are willing and able to speak out for fear of political intimidation and retaliation, concern about jobs. And we need to have these scientists. We found Bruce Lamphere. We brought him from Canada. He felt free to speak out here. And the Endocrine Society is going to be coming to one of our meetings. But we could really use maybe a pool of scientists, especially now since we have Zoom, who would be willing to participate in local meetings to explain about toxins, about PFAS, even basics like about lead. One scientist was fired from the University of Colorado. He was a world-renowned researcher on air quality, and the oil and gas industry didn't like him, and so he was fired. We have law firms who are constantly badgering the legislature, and they show up at every hearing. So it's very difficult to find people who are willing to speak and able to speak without fear of retaliation.
That's unfortunately a problem that has gone on for many years, and it's one of the things I try to explore a little bit in my book, Exposure, as well, is just,
I loved your book. I loved your book. It's my Bible. I carry it around everywhere.
Some of the pressures that exist on scientists, particularly in the way in which things are published in peer-reviewed literature, in the system that exists about who does that peer review. A lot of times it's the folks that are making the chemicals that are doing the peer review because they're the ones who published on it before, etc. But, I actually was out in Colorado speaking with, I think it was in Colorado Springs with the group in Fountain. As you know, there's a lot of military presence in Colorado, and a lot of the PFAS contamination, for example, is outside of military bases. So there's been a lot of publicity about PFAS in Colorado. There are folks in Colorado, just so you know, that I know are working on this actively, particularly at the Colorado School of Mines.
Right.
Some of the folks there are very, very respected in looking at how does this stuff move through the environment and what types of remediation is available. So there are active communities forming in Colorado that are active on these issues. I'm happy to afterwards give you links to any of that if you'd like it. But this is a systemic issue. there are books that have been written about this, about how science can be manipulated and pressure is put on scientists. Manufacturing Doubt, I know, is the name of one of the books, where there are entire industries created of consultants for hire, whose sole job is to publish papers to create uncertainty and doubt about facts that otherwise exist. And that's been going on, unfortunately, for quite some time. And the antidote to that is public awareness and public understanding that that's happening, and making that known that that's occurring and where it's occurring and who it's occurring to. We saw some of that with PFAS. We had a scientist who had a paper that he was putting together to show that cancer was being found at elevated levels outside of Parkersburg. It was going to be the first paper ever published showing elevated cancer related to these chemicals, and it was in press. And once he mentioned it publicly, it was suddenly pulled out of press, and the editor was fired of the journal. So things like that happen, and I think people would be surprised, to hear that things like that happen. But the more we are able to talk about it, make it known, and that that hopefully that minimizes the situation continuing, bringing it out into the open and shedding light on it.
Your presentation at the Colorado School of Mines was really powerful. 800 people showed up, and I think it really was the start of a really big awareness on a broader scale, so thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much.
Eric and Alani, I have some people who need to be assigned into breakout sessions, so could you check out the chat and keep this conversation going, please?
Absolutely. I see that someone asked how communities in Colorado are fighting this. What kind of legal support do they have? Specifically, Robert, if you have any resources that you think communities need to be more aware of, or anyone that you personally have worked with that you think is very knowledgeable and would like to pass along?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of litigation, unfortunately, going on all across the country now because of these chemicals. There are cases that have been filed for communities in Colorado. So a lot of that's pending. There are a number of resources available online, particularly from different environmental groups that are trying to make information available to people that are just maybe learning that this stuff has been in their water, or concerned or curious about what the health effects might be. And some of those sources, Environmental Working Group, Center for Environmental Health, Green Science Policy Institute, Safer Action, Safer States. There are different groups out there, and you can find information if you search for PFAS or forever chemicals online. And there's a lot of really good work being done to try to make information available and accessible to people. Particularly now that people are trying to figure out, hey, is there a way I can avoid this exposure? And unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of information available to consumers over the years about which products these chemicals might have been used in making. I mean, this stuff has been used in so many different products over the years: stain-resistant waterproofing clothing and carpeting, fast food wrappers, packaging, firefighting foams. But if you're a consumer, you probably wouldn't have known whether PFAS was used in making those products. It wasn't regulated. It wasn't put on labels. So there wasn't much information out there. So these groups are trying to provide information to people to help them understand what kinds of products might have been involved, and importantly, which companies are moving away and have publicly come out to say, we're not using these chemicals anymore, or here's some alternatives, so that people can start making a choice and maybe start selecting things to help try to avoid any additional exposure. So that process, unfortunately, is just sort of now beginning.
Well, thank you. Okay, so Miss Sandra, she said a lot of what we heard in the first session was actually was to act locally. How do we get our community to test for this chemical?
Well, it depends on where you're located across the country. There was beginning around 2013, 2014, the federal US EPA required some of the larger public water supplies across the US to start sampling for two of these chemicals, PFOA and PFOS. Unfortunately, that was information that was provided primarily to the US EPA and not necessarily provided to the water customers because the chemicals are still unregulated. But there are states that have gone forward and done their own sampling that encompassed more water supplies, maybe smaller ones or different ones. And so it really depends on your state. Michigan, for example, has gone out and done comprehensive testing. New Jersey has done that. Ohio has done that. Pennsylvania has announced they would be doing something similar. Because these types of water tests are not inexpensive. They can be very expensive. And there aren't that many labs, frankly, that are qualified to do these tests. You want to first try to find out whether or not you're in a location where your state, government, or some other authority is already doing the testing and the data is available somewhere, maybe through your water supply, or if not, if there are funds available locally for you to get these tests done, because they can be rather pricey.
Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Sandra. Miss Jean, sorry. She asked, please ask Mr. Bilott what he thinks of the rights of nature approach as alternative legal approach towards protecting local communities from chemical exposure.
Interesting question. And by the way, before I forget, on the last question, the Environmental Working Group has a great map online that I think is interactive. If you click on it, it's a map of the United States that shows you where sampling for PFAS has occurred and generally what the results were. So that's another resource out there if you're not sure whether the testing's happened. There's been a lot of discussion about the concept of trying to recognize certain fundamental rights. For example, the right to clean water, the right to be free of chemicals in your blood, or the right to clean blood. In the United States, that is still sort of in its infancy. There are those types of rights I know have been advocated for on sort of an international basis. There are some treaties that recognize some of that. It's a new concept, but one that's really focused on trying to find different legal bases for people to be able to pursue claims. Should I have a right not to have these chemicals in my blood? Should that be recognized as a basic fundamental right? Do I have the right to clean water? But we're in a country right now where people are given the right to put chemicals out in the air, in the water. They're given permits to do that. So it's a complex legal issue, but one that is gaining a lot of discussion recently.
Wonderful. Looks like we don't have any other questions at the moment. I guess personally, I'm curious as what you believe, Mr. Bilott, is the most important thing at this time. Like, what can we as individuals do to help this cause?
Well, I think first and foremost, accept responsibility. This is up to all of us. We can't sit back and just assume somebody else is going to take care of this for us. That there's somebody will take it. Somebody will handle that. Somebody's going to, make sure there aren't bad chemicals in our environment or in our blood. There must be somebody handling all that. We each have to recognize that we have the power to make sure that these things don't keep happening, and that we make our voices heard to say, this ought to be done differently, or here's the way it ought to be done. We can't just assume somebody will do it for us. And if those of you who had the chance to watch the Dark Waters film, could see somebody like Earl Tennant, the farmer, the cattle farmer in that case, who was able to stand up and say, no, I'm going to make sure that this gets changed. It may be a huge company on the other side. The law may be not on my side, but he was able to stand up and being persistent, and he was able to generate some amazing change. I think each of us needs to recognize that we can do that too.
All right, Miss Deborah asked, Mr. Bilott, can you say more about why the precautionary principle isn't recognized in the chemical industry?
This is a complex question. In the legal world, and again, I try to get into this a bit in my book Exposure. You've got this really complex system where if you're the person who is bringing a claim saying that you've been exposed to some dangerous chemical in your drinking water, under the U.S. law, and I'm kind of oversimplifying here, but just as for matter of discussion, under U.S. law, you're essentially told, you, as the person who's been injured, it's your burden, if you go into court, to prove that chemical can cause you harm. Right? You're the one who has to prove that. The other side doesn't have to prove anything. They just have to sit back and say, you haven't brought enough evidence that causes harm. And under this precautionary principle, with the argument you hear is that is reversing the burden of proof that we use in the U.S. court system. That's essentially saying, no, if I've been exposed to something, you, the person who's exposing me, you need to take action to prevent that from happening once you know that there's the possibility you might be hurting me. I shouldn't have to prove that I've actually been made sick, that I actually have cancer before you do anything. So it becomes this legal battle over burdens of proof. Who should be the one who has to actually prove something, and how much do you have to prove before somebody needs to do something? So you've got this kind of fundamental clash that goes on in our legal system, whereas in other jurisdictions, they more readily recognize this precautionary principle that if there's evidence suggesting something might cause harm, you need to act then to stop it. You don't have to wait until somebody can definitively 100% prove that it will or that it did cause the harm.
Okay, in an attempt to keep us focused on the science here, I'm going to relay Mrs. Walsh's question. What is your outlook for the executive or national government regulating these chemicals and others? Or what do you think should be the next steps in regulating?
Yeah, keep in mind, as we sit here today in the year 2021, there still is no federal drinking water standard for any of these PFAS chemicals. Even though this has been going on, I think these chemicals started being released almost 70 years ago, and it took all these years to get this information out about these chemicals. We now know how dangerous PFOA is. Some of the most massive human health studies ever done on any chemical, confirming links between drinking that chemical and 6 diseases, including cancer. Yet we still do not have a federal drinking water standard for that chemical. That process is dragging on. It's a very slow, cumbersome process. States have moved forward in the meantime as this story has finally made its way out to the public. States have moved forward to set their own standards and guidelines. Yet what we've also seen happen just within the last year or so, as the movie Dark Waters came out and the documentary The Devil We Know, and this information finally started making its way out to the public, and people started to finally realize this is a nationwide problem. For the first time, we have seen legislation being discussed at the federal level at the national level to finally adopt standards, rules for these chemicals going out into the environment. And that's bubbling up now. I think we see sort of momentum building, and I suspect that we will see some action here in the very near future. I think finally moving forward on a national basis to address these chemicals. I'm optimistic that that'll happen. I've been waiting. I think all of us have been waiting a very, very long time. But I think we see that things, because we're all talking about it, because of events like this, with people demanding that these changes occur, I think that the momentum's there, and we'll see it happen in the near future.
Okay, Miss Rebecca asked, is there a piece of legislation that her students can advocate for? Would you say that the federal, I'm sorry, I forget exactly what you said, but a federal water regulation, do you think that would be that legislation?
In fact, on the very last day of the prior administration, it was finally announced that the U.S. EPA would in fact regulate and set drinking water standards for PFOA and PFOS. But that was the decision that they would regulate. So it's going to take some time to actually do that. It may be a couple of years. But I think that's critically important that we have those standards. Because as I mentioned, there are states that have moved forward to set standards like that, but there are a number of places where there are no state guidelines or other standards. So the only thing that would apply would be the federal number. So it's critically important, I think, that folks be assured that they are drinking safe water, and we need to have these standards and guidelines finalized.
I just want to add from someone who works at one of the federal agencies in Cincinnati as a researcher. PFAS is a huge priority for our Office of Research and Development. There's a lot of active research going on drinking water removal of PFAS, which I'm most familiar with. But yeah, from a regulation standpoint, definitely stuff needs to happen. I just want to let people know that it is a priority on the research side too.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And in fact, there has been some incredible work done at the US EPA and the state agencies. And if anything, we need to be supporting more funding for our agencies so they can get these things done and we can get these processes moving forward. There's been cuts, unfortunately, over the years in a number of our agencies. And we need appropriate funding and staffing. And I'm optimistic that the situation will hopefully be improving in the future here, because these are incredibly important functions and incredibly important people that we need to make sure have the right funds and the right resources to get these things done. So thank you.
Yeah, that and relating to this to environmental justice is one of the major directives that's coming down from the newest EPA administrator as something that we're really focusing on moving forward. So again, cautiously optimistic about what's going to happen here soon.
Terrific.
I would just briefly add, for those who have been asking, what can we do? How can we get involved? One of the major policy revisions that we need, in my view, is to protect the researchers and the professionals at agencies like the EPA, so that every time there's a turnover in administration, their foci aren't flipped upside down. So from a policy standpoint, I think city, state, federal, we can be strongly building coalition and mobilizing to advocate for more continuity in agency missions that aren't so tied to the executive branch. I'm sure that Mr. Bilott would say that that's a legal, whirlpool, if you will. But I think the only way that we can hope that the best science and the best regulations are going to stay constant would be to have that continuity regardless of what kind of administration is in the White House. That's just my view.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, with agencies, particularly federal agencies like the EPA, you've got not everybody's in the same position. You've got career staff people that have been there for many, many years throughout multiple administrations, and then you have politically appointed folks. So there's a division there, and we've got to make sure that the folks that are actually doing the work and doing the research and doing the science, I agree, have all the resources they can, and to make sure that continuity also stays there. This is something that's being researched. For example, even with the U.S. EPA going back to the early 2000s, if not the late 1990s. And so it's important that the people that have worked on it, that worked on it back when the first draft risk assessment came out in 2003, that folks are able to make sure that there's continuity of what's going on now in 2021. So, it's difficult with turnover and staff and resources, I'm sure, but it's critically important.
Thank you, Mr. Bilott. Michael asked, in North Carolina, the groundwater quality standards do not permit PFAS. The NC General Assembly passed a law that would have provided relief, yet Secretary Michael Regan will not and did not enforce the established NC groundwater quality standards. How do we hold state officials accountable to enforce the state laws and standards?
I'm afraid I'll probably have to defer on that one. I'm not completely familiar with what's being referred to there. I apologize.
All right. Another question is if your legal fight with the DuPont company is still on.
Well, yeah, I have to say sort of yes and no, in the sense that the legal battles are definitely continuing. But what is the DuPont company has sort of changed. What we saw happen here just actually around 2015 is DuPont actually spun off its entire Teflon-related business and the business that was using these chemicals into a new company called Chemours. And then what was left of DuPont merged with Dow Chemical and then split into 3 new companies. So it's a little confusing as to who DuPont is anymore. But this litigation with PFAS chemicals continues against those folks and others like 3M, that were making these chemicals and releasing them into the environment for decades. So unfortunately, it continues because people are still being told that there's not enough evidence to show that this is causing harm, that they have to prove it, and are being told that they have to take people to court in order to get their water cleaned up and to be able to hold folks responsible for these costs. And that's the kind of thing that shouldn't be happening, but it is. So the litigation continues.
Mr. Waters, did you have a question for Mr. Bilott?
Yes, Mr. Bilott. The question that was asked, I live 3/4 of a mile from the center of the plant here in Fayetteville, North Carolina. The North Carolina groundwater standards, how it's written, because there is no standard set for all of these PFAS, they defer to what's called the practical quantitation limit, the lowest level it can be detected by a certified lab, which is 2 per trillion. Our issue that we have here is that Secretary Reagan, who leads the DEQ here, will not enforce that standard for groundwater. The General Assembly actually passed a law, State Statute 143-215-2 alpha, to basically give him the authority to force Chemours, DuPont, and to run municipal water, dig deeper wells, or provide us clean water. Yet he won't enforce that law either. So how do we hold these state representatives accountable, kind of like what happened in Flint, when they won't enforce the laws to provide clean water for us?
Well, I have to be careful since, as a lawyer, I can't really be offering any legal advice on what particular claims ought to be pursued or offering any opinions. And just to be clear, I'm not doing that here. I'm just trying to provide information on background and science and all. But that's something I would suspect is dependent on North Carolina law and something you probably want to consult with a North Carolina lawyer about.
Okay, I'm trying that with Josh Stein and not really helpful. Gotcha.
Okay, well, in an attempt to end on a lighter note, Miss Jean asked, did Mark Ruffalo, who played you in Dark Waters, consult you in the production of this new environmental documentary, Invisible Hand? Again, a story about communities to defend their rights against exposure to industrial chemicals.
Be honest, I am not familiar with Invisible Hand. Mark Ruffalo, I know I consulted with Mr. Ruffalo and the whole team on the production